Leverhulme. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that.
That's fine.
Okay, Research Center for Demographic Science at Oxford. And lastly, we're joined by Sarah Patterson, who is a postdoctoral fellow at NIA and at the University of Michigan Population Studies Center. Whew, lots of words. Okay. So I just want to say again, thank you all for joining me. I'm going to share my screen and get started here. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Oh, not my email. Okay. All right. I'm going to present. Oh my gosh, I started at the wrong slide. Sorry, everyone. Okay, here we are. So thank you all for joining today for a third time. Just want to mention again, my name is Shannon Crane. I am a Media and Outreach Coordinator for the Population Studies Center at Penn. And for the past several years, I've been managing social media for the PAA annual meeting, which is kind of why we're doing this today. And we're going to be talking about Twitter for population science researchers. So I just wanted to give you all a brief overview of what today's webinar is going to consist of. I'm going to do my presentation where we'll cover context, considerations, content, and some tips for better tweets. Then we're going to move into our panel discussion with our lovely panelists. And lastly, we're going to go into some audience Q&A. Feel free to submit questions throughout. If you have any clarifying questions, let us indicate so in the chat, and I will try and answer them as we go along. And feel free to ask any questions during the panel discussion too. All right, so today we're going to be focusing on Twitter, though there are other platforms where people are sharing research, such as academia.edu, ResearchGate, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. I will add that Facebook is less so of a platform for public dissemination of published research, but more so I've seen a lot of academic communities create Facebook groups. And a lot of conferences have sections that have Facebook groups where they share kind of updates on research and things that might be coming out. So that's just like a aside at Facebook point. And yeah, so today we'll be covering Twitter for the most part. All right. So I just wanted to give a brief overview of Twitter at a high level. So there are almost 200 million daily active users on Twitter, 500 million tweets per day, which is a lot of content, and 22% of US adults use Twitter, and 42% of those users are on it daily. And about 70% of Twitter users say that they use this social media platform to get their news, which has brought to light some questions, not all of which we're going to address today. But another important note to make about Twitter is that it really is a platform for influencers, and not influencers that are similar to Instagram or TikTok, where you're doing a lot of buying and selling of material products. But a lot of people are on Twitter to share thoughts and ideas and for commentary too. A little side humor there sometimes, but many journalists also have Twitter and have Twitter accounts, and a lot of media actors are also on Twitter. So it just kind of gives you an overall kind of look at what the platform really consists of. Okay. So next I wanted to talk about, after we talk about, the high level overview of Twitter, what it's the climate like for population researchers online. And first, what we see is a lot of sharing of experiences. People are sharing their experiences about submitting articles, reviewing articles, and kind of like the day-to-day of academia. People are sharing their experiences about presenting. And I'm going to bring this up later in the presentation, but academic chatter is one hashtag where people really use that to kind of create and continue dialogue about academic experiences. Also, people are networking on Twitter. So one thing that some of you may or may not be familiar with is that a lot of people in newer generations are making friends and actually creating relationships online, which might seem a little scary, but in this context, it's actually more common than I think some might guess. Another second category of things, or what the climate is like, is dissemination. So I think what Twitter has done is allowed for a lot of researchers to share their blogs and op-eds, which are really interesting kind of content that I think is becoming more and more popular. I've seen more trainings for people that are scientists that are writing more op-eds and blogs, and then published research also. So with Altmetrics, people are able to share their research, have a publication, and then also track that back. So you can look at Twitter mentions of your publication, you can look at news mentions of your publication using Altmetrics. And so this has kind of provided a really interesting tool. And if you look at their website, they have pretty in-depth guides about how to report on Altmetrics, whether it's for your tenure application or other things that you might have as a part of your academic structure. And lastly here, we see that people are connecting with the media. So this is kind of one point that I think I'm going to make throughout the presentation, but because journalists are so present on this platform, it really provides an opportunity for you to make those connections. And this also includes funders, policymakers, and stakeholders. And as you can see, I've plugged one of our panelists here. So this is a tweet that Courtney Quote retweeted. And they're just discussing kind of the process of giving feedback and a review. And I think that this is the type of content that we don't always get to really see in our real lives, and it doesn't always come up in conversations, especially surrounding review, when you're in that room, when you're reading the article. And so I think Twitter really provides a place for people to share those experiences and give advice. So yeah, all right. Oh, I went too far. Oh, where am I? Sorry. My mouse is slipping. Okay, so all of that being said, the public may not understand exactly what demography and population science mean, let alone what you all do in your day-to-day. And yet, much of the research in population science and demography, and now more than ever population health, are intertwined with national discussions. And people are really interested in these topics, whether it relates to the 2020 census, health disparities in the COVID-19 pandemic, or overall population changes. Your research is interconnected with these topics. And I think a really thoughtful example of this relationship is Leslie Root's op-ed in the Washington Post from 2019. So in 2019, there was a terrorist attack at a mosque in New Zealand, and the shooter began his manifesto with, "It's the birth rates." And to be clear, I'm not, nor was Leslie, inferring a causal relationship between the shooting and demographers' discussion of birth rates. But I think an important takeaway from this op-ed, and I think what Leslie Root was really getting at, was that we need to be more clear and concise about communicating our research. And one way to frame this kind of discussion is in the context of social media, where every tweet, every tweet presents an opportunity for you to finesse your science communication skills. So an important part of this is to take plenty of time to draft your tweets. I usually take between 5, 10, 15 minutes to draft and publish tweets. And sometimes I'll do different versions, and I'll get into that a little bit later about the tools that I use. But another really important part of this is to recognize that everyone who sees your tweet is not going to be equipped with the language and scientific framework to understand complex processes if they are just simply stated. And we're going to talk a little bit about the ways in which we can finesse that communication. So, great. Okay. So before I think anyone should really start their Twitter account, or maybe if you already have started it, this may be a good way to reposition yourself, is to take into consideration these questions. And so asking yourself, what is your voice? How do you want to use it? And who do you want to connect with? All of these questions can kind of lead you toward goals and outcomes, and kind of put your professional Twitter account in a framework where you can really be more purposeful. And I just want to add in here about this third bullet point. Does your institution have a social media guide? So some institutions have policies that might be relevant to dissemination. And so it would be helpful, I think, in some cases to review those policies, but also most institutions have communication professionals that you could reach out to if you had any questions. And speaking as a communications professional myself, I'm always happy to talk with people and help answer questions, but really also just have conversation and discussion, because I think that's when I learn more about my role, which is supporting research. And I think it's also just creates an open dialogue for all of us. So these last two bullet points are pretty important. What do you want to accomplish using your voice? Followers, hits to your websites, citations. These are all things that we kind of talked about in the context and climate part of this presentation. But lastly, I think it's really important to consider what are the real world implications of your research. Twitter is not necessarily a silo. And so I think that some of us have experienced scientific silos in our career and in our work, but it's important to consider that this is a public platform where if you are getting that traffic and if you're accomplishing your goals, you also need to think like, what's the why here? Not just how did I do this, but why am I doing this? What impact does it have on our lives? And so that's just, as a final takeaway. Also, just as a quick note, we were just talking about this before starting the webinar, but if you haven't yet created a Twitter account, it's important to consider using a professional photo if that's something that you're interested in. And also, when you create a Twitter account, you have to basically search as you're doing it for handles, your Twitter handle. And so using a Twitter handle that is an effective, recognizable, way for your colleagues to discover you, I think is also really important. My old personal Twitter handle was Shanooner Crane, and now I've changed it to something different. So just as an FYI, I think that if you're using Twitter in this kind of more professional context, it's important to consider what actually you look like in your photo and what your handle is. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of Twitter content. So really one of the most important things is be yourself, authenticity. We were just talking about how Twitter has, 500 million tweets a day. There's almost 200 daily active users. people really don't want to see, content that has been, that it doesn't have kind of a personality on its own. Like you want to represent yourself as an individual on Twitter. And developing your voice and followers takes time. So we started a Twitter account for the Population Studies Center in 2016, and our growth has been slow. It's not necessarily something that everyone should expect to happen, which is like this idea of going viral. Sorry, it's a bust. But a lot of what we're going to talk about today is developing organic followings and really putting that effort in to develop Twitter relationships. And part of that is that no one really wants to hear about you all of the time. Usually I recommend for people that are trying to build a Twitter following or a Twitter presence that their content should be about 70% their colleagues and other content that they find and share, and then about 30% your own work. You can go 60-40 on that or 50-50, but it should really not, it should be more collaborative. And I think the whole point of this is to just build community, and you're doing that through engaging with other people's content. And so as a last point here, Twitter has had different character limits over the years, but right now it's 280. And I think a really important part of this is to ask yourself, what does your post really mean? So just, a minute ago, I was talking about why are you tweeting? What is the motivation behind sharing your thoughts and your work? But another part of this is, what does your tweet actually really mean? And I just wanted to add in here this Dejargonizer link. It can be an interesting tool to use. I wouldn't say that it's fully, vetted. I think it's a guide in some ways, but that's just as a side point. Cool. So now we're going to talk a little bit about tips. So the first tip is, when it comes to Twitter, quality versus quantity is, I think, a really good and achievable standard to hold for yourself. So one thing that I'm sure we've all experienced at some point in our lives is an oversharer, someone who just, I got my Starbucks coffee today, tweet, got new shoes, wearing them to the office, tweet. And some of those things can be really fun bits of your day, but it absolutely does not need to happen every hour of the day. And I think that people are really following you for your expertise as a population scientist. And granted, new shoes, cat pick, all of those things have their place. And I think it's totally okay to be yourself and be your individual. And, all of our lives are also not just work and population science or demography or whatever your field is. So that's an important thing to take into consideration. And I just also wanted to add here that each post should have, or each tweet really, should have one and only one ask. So I wanted to highlight a tweet here. I think everyone should be able to see that pretty clearly. But essentially what this person is doing, it's just one tweet, and they're just linking to their new article that they published. The tweet has an image, and then at the end, you can see that there's a thread. So one way that you can go beyond your 280 character limit is to create a Twitter thread. And I think what this really does is allows for each individual tweet to have a specific thought. And when you try and pack too much into one tweet, it can be really overwhelming and also really difficult to write and draft sometimes because you're trying to communicate too much in such a small space. So I think threads can be a really cool way for new publications, especially where you have something that just came out, you want to talk about it, but there's different parts and levels to it, which there are in most articles. I understand that, but I think a thread would be great for that. And it also allows for more robust storytelling. Threads are not only just for sharing articles, but you can really tell a story using a Twitter thread. And that is something we see too. Cool. So our next better tweet tip is to tag relevant accounts. So one example that I wanted to raise today is a tweet from a colleague of mine who tweeted about their new article and linked it. But as you'll see, they tagged all of the kind of funders, publishers, and institutions that were involved with this article. And what this does is it can raise visibility for your tweet. So if you tag POP America, PAA, which we're all very familiar with, you might get a retweet, or you might get people who are also tweeting about that. And I'll also talk about hashtags in its slide too. But it also lets funders and centers know. I mean, every time that someone tags me being Penn PSC in an account, I get a notification. And I'm always happy to retweet and share new research. So just as a level. Also, when you're tagging individuals or co-authors, like not institutional level accounts, it's definitely helpful to go search, go follow them, but make sure you're tagging the right person. And I will share some tools about how I double, triple check myself in doing that at the end of this too. Okay, so next we're just going to talk about this slide, which I really, really, really love. An important part of using Twitter and being online and using social media to disseminate are visuals. And so not every point that you want to make necessarily needs to be said using all 280 characters. And sometimes it can just be one sentence with a really effective visual. Images and visuals can increase your engagement of your tweet by up to 3 times. And I think that this is something too that's becoming more relevant for when you're writing your article, like data visualization and kind of creating a graph that looks cool. I feel like some people in the back of their heads know that they can use that to disseminate and kind of pull in as like a visual hook. And that can be really useful sometimes. So anyway, I just love this graphic. I just feel like it does, all the work of the tweet. Okay, I just wanted to quickly talk about hashtags. So I think maybe a few years ago, hashtags were like really popular and everyone was using hashtags in almost every tweet, which was very cool. I think that today it's a little less so the case. And generally, I'd say 2 to 3 hashtags is like kind of the industry maximum. Otherwise, you're getting into this territory of this tweet where it's kind of visually hard to look at. Hashtags are essential to most tweets, but too many makes tweets unreadable. So you'll see, I think, throughout exploring Twitter as a space for academics and for population science researchers, that there are certain hashtags that people use. A lot of conferences use hashtags. And so when PAA happens next week, be sure to use, hashtag PAA 2021. And there are also just some fun accounts too. I know that there was at our last in-person meeting, a PAA alpaca kind of hashtag going around, which is, if you don't know, I highly recommend looking it up. Okay, so next I just wanted to talk a little bit about emojis. So many of us kind of experience emojis as like crying and crying laughing faces in our text messages. But emojis can be visual cues as well, and they can really add to the process of drafting the actual copy for the tweet. So in this example, we see this kind of like alarm siren thing, and then the downwards arrow to signify decrease, but instead of using the word decrease, it's just an emoji. So these are, I would encourage everyone to explore kind of some of the emojis. Obviously, not all of them are going to be relevant, but I think that this could be a fun way to incorporate them in your content. Okay, so I just wanted to reiterate here on this slide that images matter. Again, they can increase your tweet engagement, but there are also lots of tools that you can use to create images. Also, as a side note, GIFs can be another fun way to do that, or GIFs, however you pronounce it. But I like to use WordSwag, ImageQuote, and really Canva is my go-to. So for Canva, you can make a free account, and basically they have templates that are the exact size graphic that you would need for Facebook post, Instagram, Twitter, and you can really do a lot with that. So it's awesome. And also, your institution might have access to a photo or image library. And I would encourage everyone to go and look at all of those. They might not be as applicable to some of your work or research, but it's still kind of cool to see. Some institutions have like stock image licensing. So they'll have a deal maybe where you can go and grab an image. I wanted to quickly point out about link shorteners. So I'm not sure exactly when Twitter started automatically shortening links, but they take a link and they shorten it to 23 characters. But you can always use bit.ly or tinyURL to shorten your links. And I remember a few slides ago, I was talking about the tools that I use to draft my tweets. So I like to use Notepad and Word in drafting my tweets. And I always like to have different I like to use the links and then also kind of use all these different tools to make versions and then kind of pick out which is the version that I think is going to work best in the context. So there's lots of different things that you can do with this. And also, just want to clarify, as a communications professional, I'm not tweeting directly about my, constant urge to want to adopt a pet. So I'm not tweeting about myself personally, but I am tweeting in support of other researchers. So I understand that where I'm coming from might be like 100% of a professional context, whereas I think that it's achievable to create a balance. I think we'll talk about that a little bit too in our panel discussion. Lastly, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you have a Twitter account, you can use Twitter Analytics. And again, this might be coming from me, but it can be really helpful to look at your tweets in a kind of back-end review way. So you can look at all of your engagement with your likes, comments, and retweets. And you can also look at your reach. So if you kind of feel like you're tweeting into the abyss, but you're not really sure, Twitter Analytics might be an interesting tool for you to see, how many people actually saw this tweet. And I just wanted to give this example of the PAA tweet from this week about this webinar. And I created that graphic using a Canva Twitter template. And so again, it's super easy. I highly recommend it. And they also have infographic templates if that's something that people are interested in. Yeah, cool. All right, moving on. As a last note, I just wanted to say that there's no single formula for being good at Twitter and social media. And developing relationships and being consistent in your voice and your goals are really, I think, the best way to have an online presence and develop one too. So with that, I'll just say thank you to everyone here for joining and listening to me. And I really appreciate all of your attention. So I know that I put questions here and I do see a few chats. So let me just look here. Okay. Okay, cool. I'm just gonna look at the Q&A real quick. Do you have best practices for accessibility on Twitter, like providing alt text for images? Yes, so providing alt text for images and making your content more accessible is definitely something that you can do. Maybe using a Twitter thread, given if you have like a statement and other characters, you can utilize that. But I actually have a colleague who is like an expert in accessibility online and not just on social media. So I will maybe in a follow-up point to her because she's really an expert. Okay, so the second question says, for faculty, what are considerations to keep in mind in terms of frequency of tweets? What is too less? What is too more? Any insights? Yeah, I think that's a great question, and thank you both for those. I think, we will talk about this in the panel discussion, and really, I think it has to do with what you're comfortable with as an individual and how much time per week you really feel like contributing to your Twitter page and to Twitter in general. Yeah, and actually with that, why don't I just stop sharing and we will move into our discussion. Cool. All right. So thank you all. And 1 second. Okay, so one of the things that, pardon me, email sounds. Oof. One of the things that always comes up for me in my job, and I think that one of the bigger questions for each of us that we should really ask ourselves is like, what is the benefit of me doing this? Why should I be on Twitter in the first place? I think that there has been in the past few years a lot of like concerns about the Twitter algorithm and like more kind of national level discussions about what role social media plays in our access to information and data privacy and all these different issues, which I think they're very important. And so as an individual, I think everyone should feel motivated to go look into that. Unfortunately, that's not what today's presentation is about, but I think it would be interesting to just start off this panel discussion with what are some benefits that you've found from using Twitter as a population science and researcher. So yeah, you should just feel free to unmute yourself or just hop in.
Oh, we're shy. I guess I'll hop in. Since I unmuted first, I thought everyone was going to. Well, thanks for inviting me, Shannon, and for the presentation. I'm really learning a lot too, because I am a really avid Twitter user, but I don't feel like I use it very strategically or have, do it in deliberate ways all the time. So I'm happy to share my experiences, but I'm definitely not a guru in that sense. But what I've really, really enjoyed Twitter for has been connecting with the community of scholars, many of whom I've never met. And also what I've realized, especially using it a lot more during the pandemic, is how many kind of early career scholars, especially, because I think it skews much younger than probably the rest of our discipline in general. And so for me, it's so exciting to see all the new work and all that's coming out from the younger scholars, which often have great data visualizations. I'll give a little shout out to Ilya that I saw on the chat. And I don't know. It's just, it makes me feel like I won't become a dinosaur because I will be in touch with the work that's coming out from younger cohorts. And so I really enjoy that. And then obviously this last year, we haven't been able to see each other. So, but I feel the connection by being interacting on Twitter. And I have a whole list of things, but another thing I just wanted to say that's been a benefit is real-time peer review for some things, especially this year, people are putting preprints up there, as quickly as possible, which I think has also been a boon that the work itself is just getting out very quickly. But my co-authors and I have had experiences where it's really positive. People might point out, and if you make your code and everything freely available, people can point out some mistakes or they can push you on some of the conclusions. And we've made very quick adaptations to the preprint based on feedback from Twitter. And I find that really amazing and mostly positive. Obviously, there's some negative aspects, which I think we are going to talk to, but I'm kind of an optimist. So I see the sunny side of Twitter, and I think it's a great way to build community.
Yeah, I can echo what Jen said. I'm also not a guru. And I think also my intention and goals with Twitter have evolved over time. So I think that's also, I started my Twitter account when I was going on the academic job market as a way to sort of increase my visibility and hear about opportunities. And I think it's really changed over time. For me, probably the biggest benefit of Twitter is building a community of scholars who I might not otherwise meet, right? Like even thinking about Sarah, who she and I are both population health, population scientists, but study different things. But I have been able to follow and learn about Sarah's work in a way that I don't know would have happened even at a conference setting, right? Where we still tend to go to the same types of sessions and interact with the same silos of scholars. So that's been really beneficial. I've, some of the relationships built on that started on Twitter have turned into collaborations, right, for me. And so I think that's been a huge benefit, especially again, across sub-discipline lines or even across disciplinary lines. And, like Jen mentioned, for me, aside from the network building, having an eye out for new scholarship that's relevant and important has been the other sort of biggest benefit. Sociology in particular, demography to some extent are kind of very slow moving publication machines. The work tends not to get turned around through the review process very quickly and put into print very quickly. But on Twitter, you can read or hear about preprints in real time. People often talk about projects that they're working on. And so you might even just have a sense of who people working on different topics are, so you can reach out to them directly. So for me, I think it's sort of those two things, both the community building and networking part of things, but also just keeping on top of the latest research in the field. Like Jen mentioned, I think that's become particularly true during the pandemic, where the science is evolving hourly, and staying on top of it. Twitter has somewhat helped with that.
I don't have much new to add on top of those great answers. So for instance, I actually started my Twitter when I worked at a nonprofit before going back to grad school. And I very much used it to try to talk about the research we were doing there. And then it sort of shifted over time. But one of the other benefits, I think, of using Twitter, and you sort of talked about academic chatter. I don't think I've ever used that, but I've other kind of like hashtags or group chats that go on that make the process, I think, a little less lonely, I would say, because I think especially, I'm a postdoc, so I'm sort of thinking about grad students and early career scholars. Some of the processes, like you shared the one from Courtney about how to do reviews and how to be kind in your reviews. Talking about those openly and talking about your own experiences, I think I can see how it can be a benefit to people to know, for instance, that childcare is a big issue during COVID, or that, your life events that happen when you're on the market or things like that. Just these kind of like personal experiences that we can share with other people help build community and help make people feel less alone, which I think is an important aspect of using Twitter.
Yeah, I just thank you all for your very insightful and wonderful answers. I think I agree 100% with you all. And one thing to note in terms of, you know, our discussion and the presentation, and maybe I should have emphasized this a little more, but all of the questions in that consideration slide will inevitably change over time. I think that as our careers and lives grow and in different ways, how we use Twitter as a platform will also grow and transition over time too. I think it's also just like really cool that we're building community and like meeting each other for the first time in some instances, and yet we've been following each other on Twitter for like months, if not years, and that's a really amazing experience. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So we talked about community. I wanted to maybe address the question of challenges. And I think that we could probably all pick out in our minds a few Twitter accounts of individuals who shall remain unnamed, but who kind of take on the challenges and feedback that might not be so positive in like a very head-on way. And I guess I'm just curious what your experiences have been in addressing or not addressing people with feedback that is not constructive, or maybe just not feedback at all and just commentary. And as I said, you know, Twitter is a platform of thoughts and ideas and comments. It's not necessarily all, you know, within the bounds of constructive and positive. So I'm just wondering if one of you or each of you has an experience with that and how you've handled it. You know, that also it's something I think is universal in having a Twitter account and you're just being a scientist in general. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
I think this is a really hard one, and also something that I think I'm getting better over time. You know, I think when you share your research, I mean, the goal of doing research hopefully is that other people are going to read and engage with it, right? And similar with your ideas that sort of derive from that research agenda. I also think, though, that not everybody is well-intentioned with some of their thoughts and critiques and comments to you. And I think the risks and rewards of this can also benefit drastically based on where people are within various systems of inequality, right? And so for people that are junior scholars, female scholars, scholars of color, sort of all these dimensions of inequality can open you up in ways that feel really challenging and risky and at sometimes threatening, right? And so I think that's important to just acknowledge up front if you have a public account, especially, you know, my research is largely on the links between racism and population health. And when tweets get picked up, it is frequent that, you know, sometimes you have folks who are, again, not well-intentioned, not really trying to learn or engage with the content, but really trying to make political points that can frequently be racist. And so for me, you know, a couple of things that I've learned along the way is that, number one, I don't have to respond to anybody. I don't owe anybody my time, my attention, my frustration. And so I can block people, and I've gotten much quicker at that recently. When I tweet something, I can restrict who is able to comment on it. And I often do that for work that I think might sort of bring about some of these more unpleasant reactions. And I can also just ignore things, right? And I think when I was first starting out, I felt like anytime I got a notification that someone had commented on a post of mine, I felt the need to respond to it. And that quickly turns bad because you realize that not everyone is there to learn or to engage in a civil, scholarly conversation, right? And so for me, those have been a couple of strategies is like recognizing that I can set boundaries and hold those boundaries firmly. And then there are, again, these sort of Twitter tools like restricting who can comment and blocking folks or deleting folks that you think are just sort of toxic individuals. But this, I think it's a real challenge, especially if you are tweeting about issues that have political relevance, which, hopefully most population researchers are doing.
I really agree with everything Courtney said. It also took me a while to realize that you don't have to respond to everyone. I mean, it's almost impossible to do that, but it takes a lot of emotional energy, in a lot of cases. And it does seem, since we're putting stuff out there, that, you want to engage with people. But I agree that setting the boundaries, and no one is entitled to your time, to explain things further to them. So, but that was something that took a while to learn. And a very similar story. I mean, I will say overall, I do not experience much negative interactions on Twitter, and it might be my topics are not as controversial, or I know there's certain topics where the trolls are kind of looking for trouble. So I think in some respects, a lot of academic Twitter can stay under the radar of trolls, but especially with COVID going on, there's been a lot of things have gotten politicized that you wouldn't have expected to be. And I agree that not everyone is there to have an earnest discussion. And again, I'm just I think the best of people, I assume the best of people from the beginning. So I did get sucked into some discussions where I was trying to genuinely have an academic debate. And it took me just a while to learn and realize that these people were not interested in that. And that I shouldn't actually let them use me to, to further that, because some of them were like, oh, look, I'm having this nice discussion, trying to promote the fact that I was engaging with them. And obviously that's not always what you want. So, so I am having to lose some naivete that everyone out there has good intentions for discussion. And I would just reiterate the point about, it'd be interesting to hear more how junior scholars feel, because I was going to put as one of my positives about Twitter that I feel like junior scholars have a good voice. Like from my perspective, I really love, following younger scholars, and I think of them as complete colleagues and peers on Twitter. But there have been some instances, and Ilya has been part of some really kind of attacks on younger scholars and denigrating their credentials because they're still PhD students or something, from very senior and kind of well-known people. And I think that's a real shame, and we should all defend the junior scholars when we see that happening. But there's not all good stuff that happens, but I agree you can, use block and use mute and don't feel bad about it at all. And use it to promote your own voice and not worry about every other person out there.
I don't have much to add on top of all of that. I think there's the saying that you pay the trolls with your time, and so you shouldn't. So I think that's usually the process that I take for myself. But I did want to talk about snitch tagging, because that comes up in the negative sort of side of Twitter, in terms of if people are attacking someone, it's not recommended to then tag them so that they see it. I think the sentiment that I've seen across Twitter is that, please don't do that to me. I don't need to know that more people are bad mouthing me or saying something negative. I think, instead reaching out and supporting that person, or like Jen said, sort of supporting them on Twitter in the conversation, instead of pointing that kind of gossip and bad mouthing out to them by tagging them.
I'd never heard of snitch tagging. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that does not sound like the most uplifting practice. Hey, look what someone said about you. I think, I really appreciate all of your experiences. And I think there's something really to be said and noted, which is that in each of your responses, I think that there's kind of this question of what does allyship and like what does it mean to follow someone on Twitter that you have built this community with, but then also witnessing that. And as much as tweets and sharing is really like effective sometimes, Twitter has DMs. And I think one thing that I've experienced in my personal life and in my non-professional Twitter is not necessarily rushing to comment on someone's, harsh tweet, but more rushing to slide into that person's DMs and say, hey, I don't know if you know, but you don't need to look at that. And I'm here to support you, and give me a call if you need anything. And I think that it kind of transforms. So online community is one thing, but when you're dealing with kind of very emotional and harsh and difficult situations around sometimes not even your research directly, depending on your level of comfortability with that person, I think it's very acceptable to just shoot them a quick message and say, hey, I'm here for you. I'm here if you want to talk. And that doesn't even necessarily mean I know the answer to solving this question or this problem. And I think that there's a lot more work to be done in terms of allyship in general, but it is also just, I want to say to each of you, I feel upset and motivated to address issues of racism and hate online. And I feel, although that wasn't really a part of my presentation, that it's something that all of us need to work better on. And the idea of a junior scholar being kind of targeted by people who are well into their careers and with, not the best intentions or not well intentioned at all is very upsetting. And I think that the other side of that too is that, Twitter also has allowed us to build this community where, in some research centers, you're only there with a few other postdocs. But if you're in a community online of hundreds of postdocs and you're all sharing about your experiences, it does, back to your point, Sarah, make things feel a little less isolated. Wow. Maybe if anyone in the audience has any thoughts about this too, please feel free to chime in, because I feel like it's something that's important. And even if you don't necessarily have an answer, feel free. Also, for anyone in the audience, I have the ability to unmute you. So I won't be able to turn your video on, but if you wanted to add or ask a question, I can unmute you and you can chime in using your own voice. So feel free to just shoot a chat or something if you'd like to participate audio wise. So I think, moving on from that, kind of in the same lane, I'd be curious to know over time what your experience has been in your investment in Twitter and how you've kind of started, maybe where you were when you had a moment of change, and then kind of where you are now, and really kind of what you've seen over time with not just time invested over the week, but getting to know just using the app. I think there are some boundaries with people who don't really use social media that much, but it's not because they, for any specific or particular reason, but just because they don't. And so getting used to being online and sharing can be a little challenging sometimes. So I'm just curious if over time you've seen any changes in yourself and your output. And I know we hinted on that a little bit earlier, but yeah, if you'd like to speak to that. And I think,
yeah, I was just going to follow up from before we move on. Marina said in the comments that in addition to snitch tagging, being careful about who you tag, do they want to ask yourself, basically, do they want to be a part of that conversation? You know, what are you getting them into and exposing them to? I think that's a good point to make.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, you know, for most cases, like tagging your co-author in a new article announcement is like a totally fine thing to do. But yeah, I mean, if you're engaging in a conversation that might feel like it might get a little tricky, it's definitely good to, you know, have those conversations with people not publicly. And yeah, thank you. That's a really wonderful point to make. I actually didn't even really consider that when I was putting my slides together, but it does make sense to consider who you're looping in and who you're tagging. So thank you. Okay, let me just another sorry, hold on. I got to expand the chat window real quick. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for that comment. All right. So yeah, maybe we could just talk about a little bit about your experiences over time, and then maybe we will wrap up our panel discussion and move into Q&A, and maybe we'll finalize it with a success or maybe a nugget of wisdom that you've found or heard from someone else over your Twitter careers.
Yeah. In terms of time, I just wanted to point to something that you had mentioned earlier, Shannon, is that there's a lot of startup costs. So I definitely spend a lot less time than I did, even if it seems like I spend a lot of time on Twitter, because the startup costs are so high. Like, you do have to follow people and engage with tweets and tweet yourself and get that sort of built up. And so I would say that it's natural for you to have to spend quite a bit of time up front, and then it sort of tapers off because then the machine starts doing it for you, basically. But in terms of that, as well as I think, and you also pointed this in your presentation, to be authentic to yourself, I think you should do only what's a natural extension of you. It's kind of like, I don't know if anybody's been watching The Circle, though. Different people have different strategies, right? Like, some people are real into just being who they are on social media, and some people want to be somebody else. So I think you just have to think about that for yourself. But for me, it's easiest to use if it's just sort of an extension of things I would do naturally.
I think that's true. I don't know. I looked to see when I joined because you had put that question down, and it was actually 2008, but I don't remember like using it really until practically when COVID, really dawned, is when I started using it in earnest. So I'm trying to think of tips, because I think my natural instinct is to be a very passive Twitter consumer and, to retweet things that I find are really interesting. But so one thing that I don't think I'm particularly good at, but I have realized is something that we probably, if you want to become, a bigger voice on Twitter, I think finding some value added, even if it's a simple retweet, that you just put a couple lines of why you found this article particularly useful. It's something I struggle to do because I'm laying in bed and I just want to retweet the article. But I think if you're making a conscious effort to build a following or have a little bit more interaction, then, a little bit of value added, even for just retweets or sharing material. And then, it took me, I think, only this past year to try making threads for particular work. And the threads are really effective at, I think, at least for me, they're the things that are most, get the most reach and retweets. And I guess it's not surprising, but and I really do like what you said, Shannon, that it kind of makes you hone your science communication in these short little bits. Like, you really have to summarize the most important parts. I like adding visualizations either from the paper or GIFs. Like, I think that works really well in Threads. But it's so much, and as a consumer, I really appreciate people taking the time to explain a paper in a thread instead of just throwing me the link to the paper. So I try to reciprocate, but it is a lot of effort to make a thread. They look so short, but it does take some practice and effort, but I think it's a real contribution, especially interpreting your own work for people. So it's worth a little bit of effort instead of just passively retweeting things.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think my Twitter use has also evolved and pick up in the pandemic, both because of content and because of just like I'm home all the time and have nothing to do. And so I doom scroll through Twitter occasionally. And I think, one thing that I've tried to be, and I think Shannon, you talked a little bit about this, but try to be intentional about is the types of tweets that I send. So in addition to retweeting content that I think is important, sometimes highlighting why I think it's important or not just retweeting it. For me, that's a really useful part of Twitter. It's how I learn about a lot of papers, sharing some of my own work, as well as just, critical reflections on topics that I'm thinking about, right? And so, when I think about some of the tweets that probably have received the most engagement of mine have been really sort of trying to synthesize my ideas and thinking about particular topics and where I want to see the field move, or things that I'm grappling with in my own work that I want to hear other people's thoughts about, right? And so I think that's it has been really valuable for me. The other thing that I think, I'm not also a big social media user outside of Twitter, and part of that is that I'm a relatively private person, and so I think people should feel free or not to share as much or as little of their personal lives as they want and of themselves, right? And so, this is where I'm very mindful too. I have 2 kids under 5, and during the pandemic have been working from home without childcare. And so sometimes sharing that as a professionalization, like, acknowledging the challenges of that while also not tweeting about my kids really, but I think, this is something that people have to ask themselves what their comfort levels are. It's interesting, Jen, when I was thinking about the junior scholars, I've seen this sort of like piling on attack of junior scholars' credentials or work in a way that's totally unprofessional. Another consideration that I also have is, sometimes people can get the impression that they know you via your online presence, right? And so, I'm mindful of the bias that can happen when you tweet a lot about your kids or your partner or parts of your personal life that then people have an impression of you that's not what they might get otherwise if it wasn't for Twitter, right? And so those are things that I think everyone has to decide for themselves what the benefits and limitations are. But I think as I've used Twitter, I try to keep somewhat regularly engaged too, because I think this is that's how you build the community, right? If you're never tweeting and jump on every once in a while, it can feel overwhelming and you kind of lose sense of why you joined in the first place. And so I try to at least tweet out one original tweet, every few days, in addition to sort of liking or retweeting other content.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to second everything you guys said, because I think that there's really something valuable there's inherent value in social media being an extension of our reality, right? I feel like there's a lot of discussion in general, not just in a scientific context, but how our lives are presented on social media versus real life. And I think that your comment about privacy is really true, and every person should consider what level they're comfortable with. And sometimes that's trial and error. Like, not every experience you have is going to be a perfect culmination of your ideas and then how other people engage and interact with it. But I do think that consistency with whatever levels you're comfortable with really can help with getting over those starting costs, as Sarah said, and really engaging with the people that you support and that you appreciate and value in both a scientific and in like a social way, can be really beneficial. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of nuance, obviously, right? Like it's not just, oh, hey, you can send a tweet, tag this person, you're good to go. But I really appreciate all three of your thoughts and feedback about this, because, you know, what it really is at the end of the day is it's all of us learning how to engage in this. And I think in the past year, since we've all been online for, I'll say, most of my day, it can be really hard sometimes to not only like engage in a positive way, but also, you know, there's all this research now about how being on social media for, you know, extended periods of time can be really bad for your mental health. And I will just encourage everyone to tweet with your own level of comfortability, but then also take time to step away and like go outside, be with your family. Not all of the, you know, social interactions of our lives are online, and certainly not on Twitter. And I think, you know, with each of your contributions, there are definitely some other questions that have come up, like how do you handle situations where there's harsh, ill-intentioned, you know, criticism, not even criticism, maybe just like not niceties. I don't know how to say this in like a, you know, my personal way, but how would we deal with someone who's well tenured in their career and being mean to early career scholars? Like, I think, you know, on one hand, we're all online, but if you're not a Twitter bot, people are going to recognize and see that. And if you, in general, are stirring up some hate or other types of, you know, just like harsh, I'm just going to use the word harsh dialogues or tones, I think that people recognize that. And, you know, I'm not really sure how that plays out in real life. If I saw someone being not a nice or good person online, I probably would maybe consider not really talking to them in person if I saw them at a conference, or I would come up with some other way to like address them about it. But it's really unclear. And I think this is part of the nuance of like, we're all in this kind of community, but not everyone is, I think, understanding of what that community means and what the future of the community looks like. I think that there are a lot of PhD students and early career scholars who are just really doing their absolute ultimate best. And at every step of the way, I think we should just be embracing all of that experience, good and bad, and not bad with this person who, I don't know who they are, but I would not be happy about that. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that. And I'll also just say that I really appreciate all of your time. And I think that the most important thing that I've learned is just speaking to my colleagues and friends and individuals about their experiences. And that's where I've learned the most. You know, I can read 100 blogs and still not really get a full sense of what it means to be on Twitter. And I think when we open ourselves up to communication with others, that's where that community piece and feeling connected really begins. So with that, again, once more, thank you again. I see we have some chats. We'll move into a little bit of Q&A here. So anyone, please feel free to unmute yourselves. Or wait, you can't unmute yourselves. I'll unmute you, but chat and tell me you want to be unmuted.
did want to say real quick on the
Yeah.
startup costs,
Mhm.
conferences, PAA, for instance, are a great way to spend all of your startup costs at once, because everybody else will be interacting with the hashtags and in different posts. And so you'll be able to find people extremely quickly that way. And so I just wanted to give that as a tip. If you're thinking of starting up, conference time is like the best time to do it.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just add to that. Sarah and I have been on the PAA social media team for a few years now. And one way that we have in the past, and hopefully will again in the future, gain some, I guess, interest in social media and Twitter and PAA is through this being a PAA volunteer. And so at past meetings, what we did was, it was, a group of us, mostly postdocs and early career scholars and PhD students, who would all get together throughout the conference and tweet, about just like, a cool session, something that you saw that was interesting. And then we would meet up in real life and like grab coffee or just sit down and have a quick convo. And it's not always like perfect or ideal. I think in Austin, we were like sitting at a Starbucks coffee table where we were all kind of like together. But yeah, I think, again, Sarah, to your point, there's real value in, if you are able to attend the conferences, then following up on all of that afterwards on Twitter can be a really easy way to gain some following and also follow like more and new people that might not even, be in your specific field. But I think that's kind of what PAA does for a lot of people, is it's this opportunity to attend and listen to research about, any number of different things. And I think there's a lot of value in that too. Okay. I asked Ilya if he wanted to be unmuted, but he didn't answer me. So we'll just go with that. He did, however, ask a question about defining your altmetric score on Twitter. And altmetric is being used more and more in research evaluation. Yes, this is true. This basically assumes that attention is necessarily positive. It's not always the case. For example, 3 papers from top 20 noticed in 2020 were already retracted. So the first question is, should you link, if you have a bad critique of your paper, should you link the paper in your first tweet or link it later on? Oh, all good. Thank you for that question. That was really interesting. I think that, to be fully transparent, I'm not entirely sure of the ways in which like tweets and altmetrics and links to articles all kind of correspond. And I'm sure that like over time this will change too, because I totally hear you and understand that like not every criticism, not every tweet and retweet of your article, hopefully most of them are positive, but not everyone is going to be positive. It's kind of what we just talked about, but I can look into that a little bit more. I'm not entirely sure of what that relationship will be, and, drilling down on using altmetric scores in a more, I guess, in a specific framework type of way. Like,
I think,
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think maybe what Ilya was saying is that he doesn't want to contribute to the metrics of these bad papers that are being critiqued. And I think it does come up also with tweets that sometimes people will just take a screenshot then of a tweet that they're criticizing, so that they're not continuing to amplify it with a retweet that can continue to get retweeted. I don't know. So I'm not an expert on that either, but I think there are strategies if you're trying to point something out that's negative, but not give it too much credit in its own metrics. You can maybe take a screenshot as one suggestion. Or because it is frustrating when people are alluding to something that they don't want to link to and you're trying to figure it out. So yeah, it's good to give people at least some hints of what you're critiquing, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I completely misread the question.
I
I
think
apologize for that. I was like, oh, I don't know how Altmetric calculates all those subtweets. Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I know personally, and with, kind of from my more professional framework of using and managing social media, basically it's kind of part of my job not really to critique that much. And so in general, I think that there was earlier someone mentioned, I think Courtney, you mentioned this idea of like positive criticism or constructive criticism. That's just like, hey, I saw this data set, maybe we could fix. Oh, actually, Jen, it was you. I'm sorry. You were talking about like the different kind of levels and small like kind of nuggets of constructive criticism that come through sometimes. And again, I think this is a personal choice, but if you're wanting to critique something in a way that isn't constructive, or in a way that potentially does land you in that kind of gray area of feedback that you may or may not receive, not drawing attention to the actual article, and you could do a screenshot. I know that some people have like used the asterisk to not have full words like searchable. And so that would be, I guess, another way. But yeah, I'm not really sure how I don't think I've personally had that experience in my professional career, but I do know that sometimes people will use, also you can just block words and phrases out of your Twitter. So if you're like, I don't want to ever see a tweet that says Donald Trump Jr., you can just block that out. And there are some ways where, if you're not giving the criticism or, contributing to that type of conversation, you can at least not see it for the most part, I think, in some ways. I think that's also changing too, because the way that people are navigating these different situations really depends on where you're coming from. So as like scientists and researchers, I think that, there's a lot less like want to go ahead and jump in and just like fire off a few tweets. But I think for some people that if that is their MO, then there's other kind of more technical ways to get around driving that traffic. Okay, so we have a few more tweets. Right, okay. So Marissa again is saying about Altmetrics. And, it's interesting because some universities are considering not necessarily Altmetrics scores, but what Altmetrics, I think that in some ways Altmetrics allows for us to really trace between Twitter and news back to the article. But, that score in of itself, I'm not really sure how many institutions are utilizing that. But I do think that it can be helpful in some ways. And in general, it allows now for researchers as individuals to have a published piece of work, or even, a preprint, and link it back. So, I think that there's definitely also going to be pluses and minuses with that, and we'll see what happens. So, I don't know. And if you have any further thoughts on that, let me know. And I can unmute you if you're interested. Do any of you have any thoughts on Altmetrics as I should probably put on my librarian hat at this point, but I feel like we only have 7-ish minutes left.
I
Okay.
don't have all metrics or however you say it, but I did want to talk about the accessibility thing really briefly.
Yeah.
So I think the thing to keep in mind is just thinking about the different ways that your tweets might be read in terms of like if people are using screen readers, if they're visually impaired, right? So Twitter for a minute, I don't think I even ever used this, came out with like voice memos or voice tweets. And the problem with that is that like some people can only read the screen, and so that makes it inaccessible. And so the ways that you can, or the ways that at least I know of making tweets more accessible is using the alt text, which pops up whenever you put a picture in. But I've also seen people type out the caption, either if they have space in that same tweet, if not like in a thread underneath. And using capitalized letters in terms of hashtags. There was an example, I think you can even look it up online, where they had a screen reader read, like a sentence that was hashtagged, and it just is like, it doesn't make any sense. So screen readers rely on capitalized letters to be able to read those. But I think that those are just a few of the ones that I think Twitter is making, like whenever I upload a picture, it automatically asks me for alt text. And so I think utilizing that is important.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think in general, social media's adapting to more accessible standards has been a really slow process. But I think more people are utilizing alt text, which is wonderful. And thank you for that point about the capital letters. I will reach out to my colleague. I'm pretty sure that they made a guide, an accessibility guide. It might not be Twitter specific, but I'm pretty sure that they did make an accessibility guide for like social media posts, and I can share that after the fact. Oh yes. Yeah, so Ilya is saying for not Twitter specific, but for data visualization, to try not to use green and red palettes for the potentially colorblind. And that's another interesting note. I think that, yeah, also colors do show up differently on different screens. Thank you again. You both are contributing so much. I feel like I should just, let's have you all in the panel. Yeah, whenever I design graphics for my job throughout the day, I'm always like testing it on my colleagues' different screens. Sometimes it's purple, sometimes it's just blue or gray. So it really does depend. And thank you both for those points. So we just have 4 more minutes. And I just wanted to, Marissa brought up this point of, this might be more than we can fit into 4 minutes, but Marissa brought up this point about social science and genetics work and how to communicate and engage with that work, but explicitly kind of remove yourself from the conversation of eugenics. And this is really interesting because I feel like it's come up a little bit too, and I support some researchers who are doing more genetic focused work. And, I really think that at the core of it, it might seem a little counterintuitive, but for someone that's doing work that could be interpreted in many different ways, actually having like a short video or content that isn't just a tweet to explain and really like communicate what it is that their research means exactly and for what purposes it is can be really useful, just especially about topics that can be really taken out of context. And yeah, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, like, kind of push for communications to go beyond a tweet. If you're ever in a situation where you're like, I wish I could just like have a 5-minute video about this. Like, what can I do? And that's something in my job that we're trying to support more and gain more interest in, for people to write, blogs where you have more space to really break down what it is, or, short videos. But again, that goes like beyond the scope of Twitter. But yeah, I'm just curious, do any of you have any experience with something like that?
It's not about this issue specifically, but it's to say that I think one of the challenges of Twitter is that a lot of the engagement is relatively superficial, right? And so I think going in with that mindset that most folks who see the tweet aren't going to read the paper. And so for papers that I've had that have been much more complicated, sometimes I'll just say, here's a link to my latest paper without providing a ton of sort of synthesis of some of the main findings. Because as you say, Shannon, I mean, I think working on other platforms, writing a blog post, infographics sometimes can be much more useful in terms of dissemination, because that's to say I don't have a good solution, but I think acknowledging that a lot of engagement is very superficial and most folks are not going to read the paper is a good way to sort of start thinking about before you go and tweet about some work that you think could be misinterpreted.
But one of my colleagues works in sociogenomics, so I don't know if it was because of this, but some of the journals are starting to do little short videos, like I think it was Nature or one of those, Nature Genetics, to summarize a paper that's coming out, or a short little interview with the authors. So I do think mixing up the content, in different forms of science communication could be really nice. And yeah, in the chat also, Ilya mentioned that photos, so whether it's a figure or just something you're uploading, also allows you to tag a bunch of people, which is nice. So yeah, I do think we can't ask people to get too much nuance from a single tweet. But I think we should try some new modes of science communication. Why not?
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you for both of your answers with that. Yeah, I think there's, as you said, I think that there's going to be some new innovations, however small they are, to include more people. And in terms of science communication, I mean, I'm pretty sure that most universities, whether they might not have a person dedicated to each school or center, but I would encourage you all to, if you have a paper or product project that you feel like maybe you want to lend more attention to, reach out to your communication person and see if they're interested in doing a short article, because most of those people are really happy to get the ask. And I think it just also helps build those relationships with the professionals at universities and, whatever the institution is, to help support your work too. Myself and my colleagues are always looking for new and different ways that we can help our researchers and support our researchers. So you're definitely not in a silo in terms of looking for new ways to do and communicate about things. So we are 2 minutes over. My apologies. I see that some people are leaving. Thank you all for joining again. There is actually just one more question that I wanted to address in the Q&A from Preeti. So doesn't matter if you follow more than your followers. I am more for learning than how many followers, but externally, I wonder if institutions are using this for promotions or for your reputation. So I just think this is an important question, because I feel like there's sometimes a misnomer about this, that if you follow less people than you're followed by, it's some kind of I'm very popular and I'm only gonna follow this group of people. And that might be true for celebrities, but I think in the context of population science and early career scholars, especially if you're in that starting range, those starting costs, I think that you should follow the people that you want to engage with and are interested in or have met, or they're in your field. And I wouldn't necessarily worry about that ratio too much. I don't really think it holds that much weight. And I don't think that people or universities are really considering, oh, I follow like 500 people, but I'm only followed by 16 or something. Obviously that's a really wide ratio. That would be like, oh, well, what are your tweets look like? But I wouldn't pay too much mind to having those equal out
And I don't think any tenure and promotion would care how many Twitter followers you have. So
yeah.
They might hold it against you for spending too much time on Twitter.
Yeah, no, I think that that's just something that it does come up though. People kind of feel like there is this kind of social currency with followers. But again, I mean, I don't think any of us here really, we're not really selling anything. And so really at the end of the day, it's just spreading your work and putting it in front of people who might be interested in it.
Shannon, I just wanted to follow up real quick on the thing we were talking about before we go, in terms of reaching out to like the media at your university, but also like you were saying, you run the Penn one, the Penn Pop one, and Twitter. And I think that that's important. I always sort of, my best analogy is like on the first day of class, it's easier for all of your students to remember your name than for you to remember all of their names at first. And I feel that way with sort of section Twitters or organizational Twitters, is that, they see a lot of different things and they might not necessarily see your work. So if you can tag them, they will see it. Like you mentioned, you get notifications of those. And I just think that that's a way to sort of help them find you. And then it is easier for them to find you later as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Sarah. And, for all who are left, I think that I know for a fact that each of your administrators of the POP centers are interested in, there's, I think, an ongoing conversation for organizations and institutions to add more support for things like this and for science communication. And also in that, we are all learning as well. And yeah, I think 100%, if you're in a center, go follow them. If you're a research associate being supported by a center, yeah, I think that would be an awesome resource and a good place to start. Awesome. Okay, we're 6 minutes over. It's totally fine. Thank you so much, Sarah and Courtney and Jennifer, and for all of you left in the room. I really appreciate it. And I will follow up with the accessibility kind of guide. And please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. I'm just gonna put my email in the chat very fast. And yeah, also, I just want to say a quick shout out to Betsy, who is the PAA Communications Director and Manager. And so thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and enjoy the rest of your week. And we'll see you next week at PAA. We'll be tweeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.